When compromises come home to roost, the decline and transformation of the U.S. left. Much of the writings I have learned from have been what I can now see as preliminary essays as he built his own understanding of that issue.
That the only thing that hasn't changed about Black politics since 1965 is how we think about it. The Jim Crow era kind of hangs over contemporary American political life as a kind of misdirection. So we tend to lose sight of the fact, right, that while the segregationist regime was directly and most explicitly a regime of racial regulation and explicit racial subordination, and I think another problem that we have today is that as more and more people have lost the ability to distinguish between individual attitudes and social structures and institutions, racism has displaced in the popular imagination, the popular way of talking about inequality, racism has displaced the workings of institutions, right? So that people are much more inclined now, as you know, to sort of see an unbroken line or chain of racist inequality from slavery through the Jim Crow era to last week. But those are different regimes, different social orders, and what has ultimately the continuation of, or what remains of the Jim Crow past in the present tends to be a sort of hollowed out understanding of the bad old timey times when bigotry prevailed, and people don't have enough of a sense, for instance, of how much or the extent to which the Jim Crow order was imposed on whites as much as it was blacks. Although obviously, right before people stopped pulling their hair out, the principal and direct purpose of the set of institutions was to impose white supremacy. That was the whole point. That's when it was written in the constitutions. But it wasn't imposed significantly until after the defeat of the populist insurgency in the early 1890s, and followed actually the systematic campaign of disfranchisement of 90% of black voters in the South, and depending on what state you were in, up to a quarter of white voters.
So tell me, let me jump a little bit because I know it's in the minds of my audience. How do you see the resurgence of white supremacy into the headlines of our society, into the consciousness, into, why is this happening when so many believed, rightly or wrongly, that somehow that was behind us? Can you help us? How do you understand that?
Well, I try, right? I was going to say I can help. I can help you at the same time I try to help myself. So I taught for a long time a grad seminar in 20th century race theory. And after the first 4 or 5 weeks, the graduate students found themselves getting really depressed because they came to realize that sort of Whiggish narrative, right, of progress didn't quite work. And they came to recognize that the commitments to inegalitarian ideologies aren't based on evidence, they're ontological. So what happens is when one narrative of naturalized inequality gets defeated, then it doesn't go away. But what happens is those people who are committed to a belief that there are essential, meaningful differences among subsections of Homo sapiens will just say to themselves, well, I know it's true, but we don't have the evidence yet to demonstrate it. So then when somebody discovers genes, then they all get happy and say, so now we can get the evidence. So white supremacy is an ideology, right? I remember like I assume when we were both living in Southern Connecticut, in the early 80s, the Klan marched in Meriden.
Right.
And my colleagues were going nuts about this, right? And asked me what this meant. I said, well, look, in first place, the Klan in Meriden is a bunch of alienated, disaffected, washed out of the working class people, right? They were mainly youngsters. what the first wave of what deindustrialization was going to look like. From 1868 to 1970, right? The operative question was, it was in the South at least, and of course in the 20s the claim was something different anyway, but was in the South at least, whether it was more significant that the Klan was the above or the underground wing of the Democratic Party, or that the Democratic Party was the above ground wing of the Klan. So it was a powerful political and social institution. White supremacy as an ideology has been around since race was invented, basically, right? Or at least since the 19th century. And it's there, right, as a set of scapegoating discourses, right? That frankly, like I blame the rise of white supremacy, or the resurgence, if you want to call it that, of white supremacy as much on the neoliberalized, Democratic Party, as I do on the right, right? My good friend Anthony Mazzocchi often said that neoliberalism can't satisfy people's needs and concerns and anxieties. The farther along it goes, the more and more people who are going to be tossed onto the ash heap. And if we aren't there to provide them with plausible explanations of what's messing their lives up, and at least the outline of a plausible seeming roadmap about how to make things better, then these right-wing forces that have always been there doing the same thing, offering the same set of bromides and snake oil and scapegoating, are going to be there to take advantage of it. And I think, like I've argued this too, I think you have as well, that we may have gotten to a point at which, like the equivalent of a T intersection, right? At which neoliberalism has exhausted its capacities for delivering enough to enough of the population to maintain its legitimacy as a political system. And if that's happened, then there are only two ways to go, like at the T intersection. One is to the right, and that's authoritarianism or fascism. And I don't like to. I also understand that academics like to quibble about when authoritarianism becomes fascism or whatever. And my view is that when the question arises, right, it's beyond time to think about taxonomizing it, right? All you need to do is figure out how to fight it, right? But the other direction is in our direction, basically. And the big punchline is, like with everything else, that what we need is to figure out how to start generating a movement anchored in the working class that can restore popular faith in public action, public life, public goods. And that's going to be a longer and a more uphill climb than a lot of our friends, especially our young friends who identify as leftists, would like to imagine. But
I know this is an enormous follow-up question, but on one hand, I would like to believe, and I know it's a wish, that the reality of the failure of neoliberal capitalism, the crisis that it's clearly, in my mind, in now, and has been for a few decades already, and it keeps worsening, will in some way explode in an awareness that no matter what you think about the concept of race, whether it makes sense to you or it doesn't, it's really, and I know I'm going far here, somehow beside the point, that there's a basic issue here about how you organize the production and distribution of the goods and services we all have. And if you're not prepared to change that, then you're only choosing among the horrible consequences of not choosing to go in a different direction. Does any of that make sense to you?
Oh, it makes total sense to me, right? And I take it like a step and a half beyond. I'd say that the options that exist in that scenario, right, really have more to do with organizing people to fight over, the distribution of the injustice, right? Like instead of confronting the injustice. And that leads to this other observation that one of the ways that we as leftists need to alter our thinking about this is just to face up to the fact that there's identity-based movements or discourses aren't our allies. They're actually agents of the other side, right? I mean, they've got much more in common with the ruling class agenda than they have with the working class agenda. And I think that we've seen this about Black politics, but in some ways also about bourgeois feminism since 2015, right? I mean, the response to Bernie Sanders, like I'm working on a little polemic now that was sparked by an interview that I saw that Joyanne Reid did with Buttigieg on the anniversary of the inauguration. And she, in the middle of it, made a totally gratuitous swipe at the infrastructure bill, calling it a white guy's employment bill. So this is what we're up against.
Right.